Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. In the years following World War II and the confrontation between two former allies in the war, the United States and the Soviet Union, the United States began a new wave of domestic repression against those on the left, including public figures like Paul Robeson, against homosexuals, labor organizers, immigrants, and even against federal government employees. In 1947, President Harry Truman signed an executive order to screen federal employees for possible association with organizations deemed totalitarian, fascist, communist, or subversive, or for advocating to alter the form of government of the United States by unconstitutional means. This would help bring in the era that we frequently refer to as McCarthyism, named after the former senator from Wisconsin, Joseph McCarthy. Deportations and threats of deportations were also used as a political tool in this time. Today we're going to be in conversation about this history and also how social movements form to oppose it. My guest is Michelle Chen. Michelle Chen is a postdoctoral fellow in history at Cornell School of Industrial and Labor Relations. She teaches labor and working class history, studies the intersection of work, migration, and social movements, and has covered labor issues as a journalist. She's also and has been a contributing editor and contributor to The Nation magazine in these times, The Progressive, and Dissent, and has produced two podcasts, Belabored and Asia Pacific Forum. Michelle Chen, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this program. Thank you for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
This period of time, middle of the 20th century, 1950s, it says called it McCarthyism. It's also remembered sort of as the second Red Scare. Last week we did do a show on the so-called first Red Scare, approximately 30 years before, in which deportations were used as political tools against leftists and radicals in 1919 and 1920. As we now turn to talk about this so-called second Red Scare right around the 1950s, is there anything else that, other than what I said in the introduction, that you think is important to know about this period of time before we get into sort of the details of our conversation?
Yeah, it's just important to remember that in the post-war atmosphere, anti-communist hysteria really sort of reached new heights around the start of the 1950s, not only because of what McCarthy himself was doing, but also because of a heightened, sort of intensified national security atmosphere, a wave of conservatism that sort of swept in after World War II, and really kind of a reaction to the New Deal, and a period during the 1930s in which there was really sort of kind of a blossoming of leftist sort of popular mobilization, sort of cultural organizing around the left, and actually a surprising amount of sort of influence by communists and their allies in the rapidly expanding labor movement during the 1930s. By the time we get around to the late 1940s, we're looking at the Taft-Hartley Act, we're looking at a lot of rollbacks on the progressive gains of the New Deal, and the people caught up in that are oftentimes left and labor activists who had been championing those causes during the New Deal of, labor rights, and progressive sort of social welfare measures, and the sort of McCarthyism is kind of a byproduct of the real sort of right-wing pushback against all of that.
One of the things we want to really look at is how deportations were used. As I said, I call it as a political tool in the 1950s. How does this atmosphere then in the 1950s, and I guess we're also talking about the 1940s too, how does anti-communism shape immigration policies during this period of time?
So there had been anti-communist reaction, during the 1930s and 40s, but it really sort of kicks into high gear, of course, with sort of the new geopolitical configurations that emerge after World War II, where Soviet Russia is, of course, enemy number one for the United States. And there's a real sort of push by the political and cultural establishment to sort of view the world as kind of this bipolar sort of rivalry between sort of the dark forces of Soviet Russia and communism, and the US, which is supposed to be sort of a beacon of democracy and free enterprise, right? So that's sort of the geopolitical setup. In the midst of all this, you have a left and a labor movement that, thanks in large part to the popular mobilizations during the 1930s, is made up of first and second generation immigrants, many of them from Eastern and Southern Europe, right? Many of them Jewish, and they become sort of symbolic targets for deportation, for denaturalization, under the pretext of fighting communism. So we first see some of this legislation emerge before World War II, before the end of World War II, with, for instance, the Alien Registration Act of 1940, which compels individuals to register with the government. They're seen to be part of a movement that is deemed subversive or advocating for the violent overthrow of the government, and that is mainly targeting, of course, communists and leftists. And then we have the Internal Security Act of 1950 that really focuses on, it sets up the Subversive Activities Control Board in order to surveil and suppress leftist organizations, and gives the president emergency powers to detain people suspected of espionage, sabotage, etc. And when it comes to the 1952 McCarran-Welcher Act, we really see that build on those earlier policies and also integrate it into immigration restrictions. So the McCarran-Welcher Act was seen kind of as a immigration reform bill, right? And so it does provide some immigration reforms, but it also embeds in immigration law provisions for detention, deportation, and the curtailment of due process for immigrants in particular who are suspected of being affiliated with a subversive movement.
I also think a few weeks ago we did a program on what was known as Operation Wetback. Mm-hmm. I'm not giving it that title. They named it purposefully that Operation Wetback. Sure. Do you see that as a part of this larger strategy, or is this sort of its own thing?
It was, and in fact, if you go to the congressional hearings around the launching of Operation Wetback under, by giving the Border Patrol and immigration authorities this really sort of unprecedented power to detain and expel people at the border, targeting Mexicans. They often used sort of fear of communist infiltration over the border as a pretext for tightening border controls, ramping up border security, and essentially militarizing the border. And so you really see sort of the convergence of anti-communist rhetoric, intensifying focus on national security and the militarization of sort of domestic and civil law enforcement. I mean, immigration, as you know, is a matter of civil law, not criminal law, right? But we really see the criminalization of border crossing happening at this point, combined with kind of the emerging, or rather the intensifying racial invective against Mexicans and workers, in particular of Mexican descent in Mexican-American communities, as sort of others, right? Foreign enemies. If they are not sort of politically active themselves, they are sort of seen as inherently suspect and not really part of the sort of mainstream American polity.
That's interesting to me. I did not realize that part of the justification for, again, quote unquote, Operation Wetback was that communists were coming over the border. I couldn't help but notice the echoes we hear of that today, of terrorists coming across the border.
Yes, and we know that in the wake of September 11th, some of the justifications for tightening our border controls is about controlling terrorism, of course, but that had huge sort of general social fallout for immigration enforcement in general and the experiences of all immigrants.
So in the 1950s and these policies that you just laid out, who is being targeted? You said subversives. What does that mean?
So subversive, just like the, Un-American Activities Committee of the House of Representatives, this is a very sort of nebulous catch-all, right? And it becomes sort of a default label for namely communists, members of the Communist Party, their leftist allies, left trade unionists, and others seen as sort of associated with revolutionary rhetoric or kind of socialism that is militant and thereby threatening to the sort of social order. This is how it was perceived, of course. And
So
Many
this
people
is a huge
who,
word, though, right? This is a common word. We don't hear it
yeah,
said that often today, right? Subversive. This person is
yeah. I mean,
subversive.
but you do hear sort of similar rhetoric around. I mean, I think Mahmoud Khalil, when the Trump administration has talked about him, they called him anti-American. They've used the terrorist label. They've used similar language, and sort of these labels, once they sort of get into the cultural ether, right, they become sort of a slur, right,
Yeah.
or they're a way to otherize these political movements that, in the 1930s had been quite visible and fairly prominent in the public sphere.
And that's how subversive is used. The word itself is used in the 50s.
Yeah, sort of subversive activities, un-American activities, yeah.
And who are they going after?
So a lot of them are trade union leaders, right? A lot of them had been militant CIO organizers. Many of them, of course, had been members of the Communist Party or sympathizers to communist organizations. And some of them had simply sort of been fellow travelers, right? Like people who are kind of like loosely affiliated with progressive socialist movements. And to some degree, it was really anyone whose views and whose activism seemed to run afoul of a very conservative, conformist, reactionary political establishment.
Last week when we talked about, again, the so-called first Red Scare, sort of 1919 and 1920, in which deportation was used as a political tool, hundreds of people were deported during that time. It was also associated with what's remembered as the Palmer raids. These were the raids that went and rounded up and detained thousands of immigrants. Were there these kind of raids in the 50s? Were people being rounded up?
There were. I mean, there was. I think in your previous interview, they did touch upon members of the leaders of the Communist Party being actually put on trial, right? And there were detentions of many individuals under the pretext of immigration detention. It was not perhaps not quite as much of a political spectacle as the Palmer raids became. That might have been because the Palmer raids had been quite controversial, even during their time, triggered a lot of civil liberties pushback, right, and also sort of led to criticism of federal intervention following World War I being too aggressive, right? But in the 1950s, of course, we're kind of in a new era, and immigrant detention becomes sort of a default way for capturing many of the people who have been involved in these movements. And the idea of either removing someone from the country or stripping away their citizenship, if they're naturalized citizens, right, becomes sort of a way to use immigration law, which again is a civil rather than criminal kind of law, to effectively criminalize and, if the government had its way, to permanently banish these people from the U.S.
Michelle Chen, you recently published an article, I think last year, in an academic journal about this very history. And in that article, Los Angeles, during this period of time, plays a very important role. Tell me about Los Angeles in this story.
So Los Angeles was sort of an emerging metropolis at this time. It is a site of militant labor organizing, a lot of civil unrest during the Great Depression and in the 1940s. This is also a place with a large Mexican and Mexican American population, as is today. But there's a lot of sort of racial tension around both first and second generation Mexican migrants. They make up a large portion of the working class in Los Angeles, and the 1930s, 40s are when we first see real sort of industrial labor organizing that incorporates Mexican American communities, because Mexican Americans are emerging as part of the industrial workforce. And we also see organizing in farm labor and canneries and sort of the agricultural related industries that are dominated by immigrants like Mexicans and Filipinos. And so it's kind of a seedbed of a lot of sort of left labor activity. And it's also, of course, where we have Hollywood, right? And famously, the Red Scare came down pretty hard on Hollywood leftists. And so it is also where a lot of the left sort of intelligentsia and, creatives who are involved with sort of progressive politics find themselves sort of under very sort of negative spotlight in the 1950s.
There's a group of 4 people in Los Angeles who would be known as the Terminal Island 4. And even though I am in California, I'd never heard of the Terminal Island 4. I'm in Northern California. Sometimes it's almost like a different state. But these 4 individuals are named David Hyun, Harry Carlisle, Frank Carlson, and Miriam Stevenson. Tell me about these 4 individuals. Who are they?
Yeah, so they are sort of a group that comes together because of their sort of shared persecution under McCarthyism, and the Los Angeles Committee for the Protection of Foreign Born emerges in part through their advocacy. Frank Carlson was an educator for the Communist Party, educator and organizer. He was born in Poland. David Hyun had been an active member of the labor movement and was trained as an architect. And he had been born in Korea. He was also someone involved in Korean nationalist causes and Korean sort of independence sovereignty movement. And Harry Carlisle had been a writer, and he was British born. And Miriam Stevenson, who had been a dance instructor, was also born in Britain. And they all sort of came under the sort of initial crackdown, post-war crackdown on immigrant leftists. It should also be noted that even though, deportations, political deportations, and sort of these immigration crackdowns were targeted at, alien subversives, so-called, these folks were pretty American, right? They had spent, their adult lives in the U.S., much of their adult lives in the U.S., and were organizers here. And they very much saw themselves as part of a progressive American movement. And they had no doubt that when they were targeted for deportation, it was because of that activism.
And they're called the Terminal Island 4 because that's where they were detained, Terminal Island?
Yes. So I don't know the geography exactly, but there still is a Terminal Island, I believe, off the coast. And there was a detention center there. Just like the East Coast has sort of offshore, kind of like Ellis Island at this point was a detention center in New York. And Terminal Island was sort of, maybe the equivalent of that.
That's so interesting because I always think of Angel Island here in the Bay, in which Chinese immigrants were held. You go to today and you can actually read, they would carve in poetry in the walls. It is really amazing.
Yeah, and it's always so interesting that both, the gateway for immigrants as well as the places where they're imprisoned is always an island of some sort, but they're held away from the mainland, right? And so, just like, Guantanamo Bay or Alcatraz or any of these places, right? There's something about the sort of social geography of really alienating people away from sort of the society where they live in their communities that is really powerful.
Yeah, you made me think of Guantanamo Bay as you were saying that on the island, and it was also sort of interesting. I learned from your article that both. I was talking about the poetry at Angel Island. I was reminded of that when I was reading your article when you wrote that David Hyun and Harry Carlisle also wrote poetry at Terminal Island and also created art.
Yeah. I think they had a lot of free time during their period of detention. They were, Harry Carlisle was sort of the publicist for Terminal Island 4 and the Los Angeles Committee, and really put a lot of effort into writing these sort of very poignant letters from Terminal Island and documenting his experience. And he wrote, poems that were sort of criticizing the government and what it had done to them, and also wrote an open letter to the Attorney General, sort of condemning the U.S. for taking people who were sort of decent, hardworking Americans, basically in everything and all but legal status, and basically criminalizing them for doing nothing other than exercising their constitutional rights and trying to mobilize people and organizations to try to improve the condition of working people.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Michelle Chen. Michelle Chen's a postdoctoral fellow in history at the Cornell School of Industrial and Labor Relations. We're talking about sort of the 1950s, the Second Red Scare, and how deportations were used as a political tool during this period of time. We're also going to talk, and let's turn to this, how social movements were formed to oppose what was happening at the time. You briefly mentioned the Los Angeles Committee for the Protection of Foreign Born. I think this is affiliated with what you get over there on the East Coast, the American Committee for the Protection of Foreign Born. Tell me about these organizations.
So these are organizations, well, the American Committee formed in the 1930s, sort of in the middle of the New Deal. And even then, there was there were deportations, politically charged deportations of immigrants, and there was hostility to immigrants, immigrant leftists in particular. So they formed an organization to sort of deal with this growing number of immigration cases that folks like the ACLU and advocates who were active with organizations such as the National Lawyers Guild, these progressive organizations and civil liberties organizations that really saw the intersection of immigration law and constitutional law, right? And the question emerging that the American Committee wanted to deal with was sort of what is the nexus of the Bill of Rights and non-citizens, right? How do we make sure that people who are not citizens nonetheless, have constitutional protections for free expression, right? The right to organize, due process. And they saw that immigration law and immigration enforcement was sort of a gray area in which the government could execute persecution, surveillance, harassment of activists under the guise, right, of, border security, immigration enforcement, national security. And so they saw immigrants as sort of a canary in the coal mine for broader rollbacks on civil liberties and civil rights.
Sort of as we're seeing today, sort of the same
exactly.
area.
These things go in cycles.
Yeah.
The American Committee was sort of a broad sort of national organization. There were also sort of regional and local groups such as the Los Angeles Committee that emerged and operated more or less autonomously, but were sort of loosely affiliated with the American Committee, and they operated with this ethos. They were sort of focused on protecting immigrant leftists from persecution. And it should also underscore here that they considered themselves to be like quite pro-American organizations. They did engage in assistance with naturalization for some people. They wanted to remove barriers to citizenship that many sort of immigrants might have faced, particularly if they had, a supposedly subversive political background. And in addition to their sort of deportation defense, they also saw themselves, especially during World War II, when, the left was engaged in a fight against fascism, Nazism, they saw themselves as sort of champions of civil liberties and anti-fascism domestically, right? And they believed that immigrants were sort of on the front lines of conservatism, reaction, authoritarianism that was sort of creeping in the U.S.
So fascism was a concern in the United States in this period.
Oh, yeah.
It's a word that's being used.
Yes, you also see sort of a notable change in the rhetoric and the campaign language of the American Committee from the 1930s through the 1940s and the 1950s, as they become increasingly alarmed at the anti-communism and the conservatism that is emerging, despite the progressive gains of the New Deal. Interestingly, they are so aligned with the Roosevelt administration during World War II that they don't actually speak out they don't actually speak out very much about the detention of Japanese Americans. So that is a really interesting political blind spot of this organization that I,
not unheard of.
Yeah. But, by the end of World War II, they see the sort of geopolitical winds shifting, right? And they see the domestic sort of ramifications of that, which is really a turn against political sort of anyone who is seen as sort of representing or reflecting sort of leftist or Marxist views, which had really been kind of gotten a lot of sort of gained public prominence and been somewhat validated, right, during the New Deal. And now we see sort of the polar opposite of that. And so the American Committee and its advocates see this as sort of emerging authoritarianism and a real backlash against progressivism and progressive movements.
You were talking about how this group and these groups, both at the national and I think also in LA, were making this argument for the nexus between the Bill of Rights and immigration law. How do they make that argument? How are they connected?
By simply pointing out that, the Constitution doesn't only apply to native-born citizens, right? And it's also notable that, in their name, they talk about the foreign-born, right? But they always refer to foreign-born Americans, right? And so they really sort of emphasize that just because you were born in another country doesn't mean that the Bill of Rights does not apply to you, right? And this is, of course, vital for people who are active in the labor movement and who are political organizers, because the First Amendment is basically what protects their ability to really advance these movements and advance their causes. And they really see the attack on immigrant leftists as part of a broader attack on the labor movement, right? On the right to organize itself. And immigrants are sort of just the easiest target when you want to start rolling back these rights. And so throughout all of their sort of propaganda literature and their campaign rhetoric, they really emphasize that an attack on the foreign-born is really an attack on the Bill of Rights, and it's something that all Americans should be concerned about if they care about preserving these freedoms and these protections.
I've heard that the Bill of Rights isn't about really you or me or us individually. It's actually about the government. It's about a restraint on the government, regardless of who you are, of what the government can do.
So if you're in this country, you have the protection, right, of the Bill of Rights. You have First Amendment rights, and the First Amendment does not distinguish, right, does not discriminate by immigration status. And that is something that, the current administration would do well to be reminded of. But it is something that I think even many ordinary Americans may not fully sort of be conscious of, right? You're not exempt from the Constitution simply because you're undocumented or you have a green card,
Has this been worked out? Has this been worked out in the courts legally?
Yeah. I mean, free speech rights, even sort of the right to join a union, or, all these things that are sort of linked to those basic freedoms outlined in the Bill of Rights. I mean, those are things that, anyone subject to U.S. law, right? Anyone in the country, right, should be protected by. And of course, this has obviously been litigated. And so, the details have probably been argued over endlessly, and they would probably be worked over once again under this administration, especially, with the Trump administration's kind of wholesale attacks on immigrants generally, right? But, one of the things that the American Committee and the Los Angeles Committee really tried to emphasize was that, these folks who are being targeted, they had essentially been living pretty ordinary lives as Americans. And they really sort of, whenever they described the people that they were defending, they really emphasized, he had a child who served in World War II, right? He is married to a U.S. citizen. These are folks with deep ties to their communities. And so to paint them as these subversive aliens who are trying to infiltrate the U.S. with these dangerous ideologies sort of flies in the face of the day-to-day reality. And I think that when we think about sort of the politics around immigration today, setting aside sort of current hysteria around cracking down on pro-Palestinian protests, oftentimes you see immigrants really sort of painted as people who sort of live outside of mainstream American society, or people who do not want to assimilate, or even people, of course, common sort of stereotypes that immigrants bring crime, all these other stereotypes that try to sort of define them outside of mainstream America. And what organizations like the American Committee really tried to highlight was that these people were not only sort of living as Americans, but they also were a really important part of improving life in America for working class people.
You make the argument that these campaigns in the 1950s against these anti-immigrant policies, these campaigns that come out of Los Angeles and other places, but again, Los Angeles sort of our focal point here, would create the rhetoric and the arguments that would be used ever since in the immigrant rights movement.
Yeah, so I think what's interesting about the Los Angeles Committee, which emerged, after World War II, and also the American Committee, which emerged in the 1930s, is that we did not have an immigrant rights movement as such, the way that we have one now in the U.S. This is before the liberalization of immigration restrictions in 1965. So we still had a pretty draconian system of immigration exclusion, which excluded virtually everyone from Asia, and largely restricted immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe, right? This was an immigration law that was very much informed by eugenics, right? Informed by white supremacy. And people at this time were still operating under that system as they were trying to defend immigrants' constitutional rights. And what I find interesting is that even in the absence of a post-1965 sort of immigrant rights rhetoric, we see people using sort of civil libertarian arguments, labor rights arguments, quite patriotic arguments about the salience of constitutional rights, right? And sort of embedding that within their defense of immigrants against persecution, detention, and deportation. I should point out that, the sort of immigrant advocacy that emerges after 1965 is very much entwined with the civil rights movement and civil rights laws, and the idea of sort of racial and ethnic equality, right, as being part of the sort of sphere of immigrant rights and advocacy that we're sort of more familiar with. And as early as sort of the 1930s, I think it's really interesting that you see people using sort of the rhetoric of the Popular Front, right, about multiracial labor organizing, about building a stronger democracy through sort of multi-ethnic and multiracial coalitions, right, organizing across these sort of lines that had largely divided and segregated sort of the labor movement and society in general up through the 1930s.
What was the Popular Front? What was the Popular Front?
So the Popular Front was kind of this a broad sort of universe of cultural and political organizing that happened on the left, and was really a concerted effort by leftist organizations and movements in the U.S. to promote kind of an American brand of socialist ideas, Marxist ideas, and militant left organizing. And so it was a way of popularizing right? Some of the rhetoric that had previously really been promoted by the American Communist Party, and was a way for the American left to really define itself, right? Within the framework of patriotism, right? Within the framework of a strong welfare state, within the framework of a strong institutionalized labor movement. And it sort of worked in tandem with the emergence of the CIO and a lot of the New Deal sort of labor organizing that was happening at the time.
So this is the 1930s.
This is the 1930s. And so, of course, a lot of this rhetoric is patriotic. There isn't, it's not like in the 1950s where we see a real pushback against the government as sort of an authoritarian force. There's a lot of hope for the Roosevelt administration, just seen as an ally of the labor and the working class, right? And it's in that moment of optimism that we also see an emphasis on sort of organizing across racial and ethnic lines. Of course, this is not always, these ideals not always followed in practice, by every organization, but it was an aspirational vision of building a strong, uniquely American left, a kind of uniquely American radicalism. And of course, it is that radicalism that is used to vilify and criminalize these people after World War II.
And this is what the Los Angeles Committee for the Protection of Foreign Born are picking up on. And they really do form this multi-ethnic coalition?
I mean, so the Los Angeles Committee, they really try to represent, the people who, the people on the left who are being targeted for deportation. So a lot of these folks in the Los Angeles area are Mexican Americans. They're people of Mexican descent who, many of them were active during the New Deal, right? They had joined worker movements and progressive movements at the height of that sort of labor left organizing. Many of them were trade union members, trade union leaders, right? But the Los Angeles Committee also tries to broaden its scope by waging a forceful critique of things like Operation Wetback, right? Things like the crackdowns on Mexican labor in general. And they connect the persecution of Mexican and Mexican American labor leaders, right, to this broader, sort of more generalized crackdown on border crossings, the criminalization of, sort of the undocumented immigrant, and also the fact that border security and immigration enforcement are used as tools to regulate the low-wage sort of workforce, right, that is constituted largely by Mexican migrants. And so they see the connection between industrial capitalism and the sort of the agricultural business, right, interests in regulating and policing and restricting this workforce, right, and efforts to suppress labor organizing that is trying to uplift these communities.
And the people that are being targeted by the government for deportation is also multi-ethnic. I mean, if you just look at the Terminal 4, David Hyun's from Korea, Miriam Stevenson's British.
Yeah.
I'm getting some of these people confused, but I know either Harry Carlisle or Frank Carlson's from Poland.
Frank Carlson's Polish, yes.
Frank Carlson's from Poland.
Mm-hmm.
So that what ends up happening to these four individuals known as the Terminal Island Four?
So they continue eventually they are released. It turns out that, there was a fairly robust legal defense of these folks, and they won their release. They had advocated very strongly for the right to bail, right, which is actually another constitutional right that people often forget about. And they were all eventually released. They sort of had a speaking tour where they would go around talking about what they had been through and sort of warning people that, more of this was to come, right? They were the first wave of immigrants to be persecuted. And it's also worth noting that they were detained even before the 1952 law that we were just talking about. So things did ramp up through the early 1950s. I believe David Hyun Frank Carlson eventually sort of was able to beat back his deportation order through a later Supreme Court decision that basically said that basically drew a distinction between sort of so-called subversive activities that could render someone deportable and simply being part of, a movement that may have had revolutionary rhetoric but did not actively seek to overthrow the government. So, basically the Supreme Court rolled back some of the McCarthyite hysteria that had sort of painted these people as terrorists. And so many people were able to win some kind of legal reprieve through rulings like that. I believe Harry Carlisle continued to battle over his deportation case and eventually left the country. So, I guess you could say voluntarily, but basically
self-deportation.
Basically decided he didn't want to deal with that anymore. And I believe Miriam Stevenson was also eventually sent back because, in some ways, I mean, this is an exhausting sort of legal battle for them. These people were, middle-aged at the time, and they probably believed that, it wasn't really worth it. David Young remained in the U.S. After, he was able to avoid deportation and sort of have his name cleared legally. He continued to work as an architect in California, was quite a prominent architect, but sort of ceased his sort of political activity after this experience. And I think it's interesting to think about sort of...
He seized his activity. Yeah, because this is a toll. This takes a toll. This is what you're saying, right? This takes a toll. And I think we forget about this today. This takes a real toll on people.
Yeah. And, you can't really blame them in some ways for sort of after devoting, a decade of their life to fighting this persecution, over, they were ordered deported over things that they had been doing in like the 1930s and 40s, right? At that point, at the end of the 1950s, early 1960s, they see the political atmosphere changing, and they feel like, sort of they sort of believe that their sort of political activism era was over at that point, I assume.
Yeah. I mean,
there were some who remained active, so I don't want to say that like everybody just kind of became exhausted, but, it should be noted that a lot of these folks were quite old by the time they were held for deportation or they were ordered deported because, they had been active in the 1930s. And so they were like 50s, 60s, by the time they were sort of being pursued by the federal government. So, at that point, they were already sort of the old left, right? So they were ready to, and by the time Kennedy was elected, there was a new era of activism and civil rights activism and civil liberties activism that was emerging sort of among the new left. So.
I've heard that the main idea behind immigration policy isn't necessarily to go round up everyone, but it's to scare people. Yeah. It's to scare immigrants. It's the fear that's the real purpose of a lot of immigration policy.
And I mean, that is especially relevant when we're looking at this history because, only a handful of people were actually deported. Only a handful of people are actually removed from the country. Of course, some left voluntarily, some were pushed out, but in terms of people who are actually forcibly removed on political grounds, it was very few in relation to the number of people who were interrogated, investigated, surveilled, detained, right? Forced to subject themselves to, registration and kind of like government parole, right? So all of these restrictive measures were put in place to really destroy their movements and destroy their ability to exercise their First Amendment rights. And that was really what the aim was, right? If the government couldn't banish them from the country, they could at least completely eviscerate, right, the social and cultural kind of infrastructure, right, that emerges when people are free to talk, to organize, right, to relate to one another. And through the sort of aggressive pursuit of people on political grounds, it really had a chilling effect in that way. And so this was also what organizations like the American Committee were pushing back against, which was that, even if people aren't actually removed from the country, the social damage is still enormous. And I think that is also what we see under the Trump administration today when it comes to the terror, right? That has much broader ramifications than the detention or removal of a single person. It affects their families, their communities, the organizations that they work for, and their movements.
We're down to our final few minutes, but let's talk a little bit more about today. We've seen what's happened, and obviously we're having this conversation because of what's happening today. We've seen the attempted deportation of Mahmoud Khalil. Also, we've seen now removed from the country Dr. Rasha Alawi, who's doing very important medical work, according to press reports that I've read about her case. And talking about fear in general, I've had people in the past few weeks on this show, and I'm not going to name who have asked me not to name their affiliation with their university because their university is being investigated by the government right now. The fear is real. I mean, if you were an activist on campus, and if you're an immigrant or a green card holder, whatever it is, the fear is real right now.
Yeah, and I think I see parallels between the way the labor movement was targeted in the 1940s and 50s, right, and the way higher education is being targeted today, in the sense that these are two sort of institutional bulwarks of progressivism and progressive thought, right? The labor movement is weak today, in part because of the persecution of previous decades, but now a lot of conservative and authoritarian energy is being directed at higher education, because that is seen as a bastion of liberalism, the left, wokeness, whatever you want to call it, right? And folks like Khalil and his fellow activists at Columbia have become sort of these symbolic targets or boogeymen, right, for a really sort of symbolic kind of ideological battle against this abstract notion of, a left intelligentsia, right, that is somehow undermining American values or is somehow harming America, right? And the targeting of Palestinian solidarity movements and campaigners is also a way to take a very high-profile issue, right, and exploit it, and exploit all the racism and xenophobia and Islamophobia and all these other sort of reactionary tendencies, right, and sort of distill them into the targeting of specific individuals, right? And you can see how sloppily this was executed by the administration. I mean, they didn't even know Khalil had a green card, apparently, when they went to pick him up.
Yeah.
And there's such a rush, right, to criminalize, to banish, to detain, that sort of these legal distinctions don't matter, right? And I think that when we look at sort of the war on higher education right now, even at my institution, like Cornell, there's a real sort of chill in the air because people are fearful about what to do, right? But it's also true that, no matter how much you try to keep your head down, no matter how much you try to, stay in the spotlight or sort of, not do anything to ruffle any feathers, right? You'll see that they will find a reason to come after you because it's not really about what you do. It's about what you represent, right, to people who want to take these freedoms away.
Michelle Chen has been our guest. Again, Michelle Chen is a postdoctoral fellow in history at the Cornell School of Industrial and Labor Relations. She has joined us for a conversation about the second Red Scare in the middle of the 20th century and how deportations were used as a political tool then. Michelle Chen, that was really interesting, and I thank you for taking this time.
Thank you.